she said, I'm the director for the St. Louis chapter of Reasonable Faith. And if you go to reasonablefaith.org, you'll find a lot of information there, questions and answers for the past 10 years, debates, podcasts, Bible studies, those sorts of things. So the topic I'm going to be talking about today is, who is Jesus? Okay? And when you look at this question, you can approach it theologically. You can also approach it historically, and maybe a little bit of both, right? So I'm going to lean more on the historical side for tonight. And if you take a course in Origins of Christianity, or if you read a book on Christianity, or on theology, or you watch a TV show on Discovery Channel or something, you'll probably be confronted with an evolutionary view of Christ. And Christology is just a big fancy word for doctrine of Christ or study of Christ. And you'll come away with this idea that Jesus first started as a wandering preacher who got himself crucified in the year 33. And as the centuries went on, about 300 years later, he's elevated to being the second person of the Trinity, very God of very God, both God and man, in hypostatic union, all the theological terms that Christians use to describe who Jesus is in relation to God the Father and the Holy Spirit and the Trinitarian doctrine, like that. The problem is, this viewpoint is way too late. Christians started believing that Jesus was God very early in the historical record, very early. And I'm going to talk about secondary sources and then the primary sources. So when you study something historically, you want to figure out, what are my sources for information? Secondary sources usually don't tell you anything new. They sort of confirm what's already known in the primary sources. In this case, I'm going to be looking at 3 of the secondary sources. They're not Christians, so you can't say, they're biased for Christianity, because they're not Christians. And they are also early enough in the historical record that we can learn what Christians actually believe from the non-Christian perspective. So the charge of bias is not there. In fact, the bias is on the other direction. Okay? So this is Tacitus, and his full name is there. He was born in AD 56. He was a Roman official, had various positions, and he wrote history of the Roman time period. So one of the reasons why Tacitus is probably one of the most important Roman historians is there's indications, and scholars point this out, that he had access to official Roman records, because he talks about things that that happened before he was even born, and he talks about those things accurately. So we're going to look at the Annals. He wrote 16 books of the Annals, and it covers history from about the AD 14 to AD 68. So about that time when Christianity got started. He talks in Annals, book 15, about the Emperor Nero. And the Emperor Nero, what happened was there's this huge fire in Rome, and it burnt up like 14 out of 21 districts in Rome. So it was a huge fire, a lot of damage, and so people started blaming Nero and a rumor started that it was Nero who started this fire. Let's get down with the emperor type of thing. And Nero, like any good politician, started blaming somebody else. Okay, and so he started blaming a group that people didn't like at the time, and they were called Christians. He started blaming them for causing the fire. And so in verse 44 of the 15th book, it says, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for a moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So here's a Roman historian writing about the year 64, and he's confirming that this group of people are called Christians, and that confirms the book of Acts and 1 Peter, that Christians, the term Christian was applied to the followers of Jesus by people outside the Christian group. It confirms the Christus, which is a Latin way of transliterating the Greek word Christos, which means anointed one. Christos, anointed one. And Christos was used by Jews to refer to the Jewish Messiah. So you have this direct link between Christus, the title, in Rome, in Latin, and the Messiah, the Hebrew background of what Christ means. Okay. We also learn Christ. Christ suffered the extreme penalty. In Roman society, the extreme penalty was crucifixion. If you're a Roman citizen and you got capital punishment, you get your head cut off. But that's too good for non-Roman citizens. Non-Roman citizens got crucified, especially if they were like in rebellion to Rome or something like that. They wanted to display how bad you are by putting you up and crucifying you. We also learned that Jesus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius under Pontius Pilatus. And Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea from about AD 26 to AD 36. So we have that time period right here from non-Christian Roman historians writing about the year 64. Okay, he wrote the annals in about the year 116. So that's what we learn from Tacitus. So we have Pliny the Younger, and he's called Younger because he's named after somebody who was called Pliny the Elder. But Pliny the Younger was a Roman official. He was a governor of Bithynia and Pontus, which is Turkey, and he wrote these epistles from I think the year's 111. And so he writes to the emperor, say, Emperor Trajan, I have all these Christians. They're not obeying the laws of believing in the Roman gods. They're not worshiping the laws. They're not following the Roman gods. What should I do with them? This is what I'm doing with them right now. Is it right? He's saying, I grab these Christians, I interrogate them, I say, hey, will you worship the Roman gods? If they say no, ask them 2 times, maybe 3 times. If they still say no, I execute them. If the Roman citizens, I don't execute them, I send them to Rome to get tried. Okay? Emperor Trajan responds and he says, yeah, what you're doing is good, just don't go and go hunt for them. Don't go hunting them. So that's what Trajan says. By the way, you can see these things online, these actual writings. Okay? One of the interesting things about Pliny the Younger is he describes a Christian worship service. He says some of the people he's interrogated have been Christians for 25 years. Okay? So if he's writing in 111, questioning a guy or a woman who's been a Christian for 25 years, and we get a glimpse at what they were how they're worshiping in the year 80, year 81. So we're talking 1st century. Jesus died in 33 AD. We have a worship service being recounted at about the year 81, 79, 80, 81. So very close, very, very close in time. And he's saying that those Christians, when they worship, they're singing a hymn to Christ as to a God. So they're singing hymns to Christ the way you would sing hymns to a Roman god. Okay? So right here we have indications, first century worship of Jesus as at least a god. So the last non-Christian source I'm going to look at is Josephus, and he was a general in the Jewish army. He was defeated and captured, and then he was taken to Rome, and eventually he became a Roman citizen, and he was like a Jewish collaborator for the Romans, that thing. But one of the things he did was he wrote a history of the Jewish people called Jewish Antiquities, and then he wrote the Jewish War, about the Jewish War. So in Jewish Antiquities, which he wrote in 1893, there's two references to Jesus. The first reference is in book 18, and it says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets have foretold. And these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day." Now, the highlighted words have been determined by scholars to be interpolations. An interpolation is basically Josephus writes this passage, some copyist comes later and starts adding stuff to it that wasn't there in the original. Okay? And so what's highlighted is probably added in by somebody other than Josephus. So they're not original. Okay? But that doesn't mean the rest of the stuff isn't originally Josephus. In fact, there's an Arabic version, an Arabic manuscript of this Josephus passage, and it's been studied. It's a little shorter than this passage, but it doesn't have the lines that are in question. In fact, it says, maybe he was the Christ. Okay. So most scholars think there was an original Josephus passage in book 18, and it probably said, well, there was this guy named Jesus, and he had a following, and he was crucified. Maybe he was the Christ, who knows? Maybe he was the Christ. He did a lot of interesting things, wonderful things, miracle working type stuff, and that was about it. Finally, there's the second passage in Josephus is also very interesting. He's writing about the year 62. In the year 62, the official of Rome, Festus, I believe. Yeah, Festus died, and so the new Roman official, he was on the road to get to Judea to be the governor. And during that in-between time, there was no Roman power, no Roman officially in charge. So Ananias, who became the chief priest, he took it upon himself, I don't like this guy named James. James, he's the brother of Jesus, who's called Christ. I'm gonna kill him. Totally illegal, but that's what he did. So it says, when therefore Ananias was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road, so he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, that's the Jewish court, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions is the ultimate translation. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So again, this confirms the book of Acts. And it also confirms that some of the early leaders of Christianity in Jerusalem, in Judea, were family members of Jesus. At least James was. So, what do we learn from these three secular sources? We have a confirmation of basic facts of the New Testament of Jesus. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate between the years AD 26 and 36. We find out that Christ was worshipped as God early in the first century, about 79, 80 AD. We find out that Christ's followers were persecuted. Pliny, who the second person I talked about, he has this passage in his epistle where he's describing what they're doing with Christians. They're putting animal skins on them and then letting beasts kill them, and they're torturing them and killing them. So it was not fun to be a Christian. And we also learned that, as I said, some of the early leaders of Christianity were family members of Jesus. So that's the secondary sources, the non-Christian secondary sources that are early, and what do they say about Jesus? Okay. Secondary sources only confirm what we already know from primary sources. Primary sources are the New Testament, or the writings that make up the New Testament. And so when we're looking at this, we're not looking at this as the New Testament books are divinely inspired, the divinely inspired Word of God. Okay? They're looking at this as historians would look at it, talking about plausibility. What is likely to be historical, given historical methods of testing and criteria? Okay? So this argument is not original to me. It comes from Martin Hengel, the New Testament scholar, in the 70s. And he pointed out that Paul wrote Philippians in about the year 55. Okay. Some scholars a little later, some scholars a little earlier. And we know from history, from like all the secondary sources, that Jesus was crucified about the year 33. Some scholars say year 30, okay, 30, 33. I'll just use 33 because that's what majority's consensus say. Philippians, we learned that Paul established the Philippian church about 6 years earlier. So that's the year 49. Okay? And this is a hymn that the Philippian Christians, who, by the way, were Jewish Christians, right? They were Jews who converted to Christianity. It said, though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being when he appeared in human form. He humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. So 16 years after the crucifixion, 16 years in the year 49, Philippian Christians who were Jews, their background was largely Jewish, they were already saying that this guy who died as a criminal is God. Okay? And that is radical. That is absolutely radical. You know, what would make an observant Palestinian Jew who understood that there's a world of difference between the creator and the created, what would make them say, well, this guy who died as a criminal, he's God, and then they would start following him. Okay? So that's sort of the mystery. And Martin Hengel, he said more happened in the 16 years between the crucifixion and the Philippian hymn than the centuries of Christological development, the centuries of the doctrine of Christ and how it developed, right? So I like to say the seed of those doctrines, that Jesus is God and those sorts of things, the seed of that comes back to the original proclamation that you can find, for example, in epistles, in Paul's epistle. So the question now is, well, where did these guys get that idea? Where did they get this idea that Jesus is God? Okay. And the question leads us, well, did Jesus himself claim to be God? Okay. And Jesus didn't claim to be God the way, you know, some of us would in our cultural background would say, hey, I'm God. He didn't do that. He didn't say, I'm the second person of the Trinity. I'm the Alpha Omega. I'm beginning and the end, first and last. He didn't do that. You see that sort of stuff in the Revelation. You see that. But early on, we have this understanding that early Christians understood that there is something about Jesus and his proclamation. So the next thing I'm going to show is a 6.5-minute video, and it's going to talk about what can we figure out Jesus thought of himself from the Gospels themselves, putting the Gospels through a historical filter, historical grid, to try to figure out what can we say is, yeah, that's bedrock historical. Okay?
Ever since the Christian movement began, followers of Jesus Christ have said he was God in human form. But what about Jesus himself? Who did he think he was? With the rise of textual criticism and the modern study of history, historians have developed tools to unlock this question. Today, Jesus of Nazareth is no longer just a figure in a stained glass window, but a real person of history whose life can be investigated historically. So let's examine the New Testament, not as inspired scripture, but as an ordinary collection of ancient documents. Let's apply to them the standard tests we would use with regard to any other ancient sources. When historians investigate the Jesus of history, what do they find? First, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. The Jews of Jesus' day were waiting for a promised Messiah, a descendant of King David, a warrior king who would bring military victory and spiritual renewal to Israel. They were familiar with the prophet Zechariah's ancient words. "Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem, behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey." Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, the final week of his life, is attested in independent sources, one of the most important criteria for the historicity of an event. In doing this, Jesus was deliberately and provocatively claiming that he was the promised Messiah, the King of Israel. Moreover, the plaque nailed to Jesus' cross stated the charge against him, in mockery of his messianic claims. The fact that later Christians did not use this derisive title for Jesus underscores its authenticity. For first-century Jews, the word Messiah was packed full of meaning. By assuming this title, Jesus was claiming all of this for himself. Jesus also claims to be the Son of God. Jesus' consciousness of being God's Son in a unique sense comes to expression in his parable of the vineyard. This parable matches Jesus' teaching style and employs Jewish motifs typical of his day, such as Israel as a vineyard, God as a father, the religious leaders of that time as tenants, and God's prophets as servants sent to the tenants. Once there was a man who planted a vineyard. Before leaving the country, he leased it to tenants. At harvest time, he sent a servant to collect his share of the fruit of the vineyard, but the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. So the owner sent more servants, but these too were beaten or killed. Finally, he sent his one and only son, saying, "Surely they'll respect my son." But those tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Let's kill him, and the vineyard will be ours." So they killed the owner's son. What do we learn from this parable about Jesus' self-understanding? He thought of himself as the only Son of God, God's final messenger, distinct from all the prophets and even the heir of Israel itself. Third, Jesus claimed to be the Son of Man. This was Jesus' favorite self-designation, being used some 80 times in the Gospels. This has convinced the vast majority of New Testament historians that Jesus did, in fact, think of himself as the Son of Man. Notice, not just a Son of Man, but the Son of Man. Jesus was directing our attention to a vision described by the prophet Daniel. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, and glory, and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. At Jesus' trial, the Jewish high priest accused Jesus. Are you the Messiah, the Son of God? His answer left no room for doubt. I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. By applying all three of these titles to himself, Jesus was claiming in no uncertain terms that he was the very God his accusers worshipped. It's no surprise the Jewish court charged him with blasphemy and condemned him to death. But that's not all. New Testament historians are agreed that the historical Jesus also claimed to have divine power and authority to perform miracles, cast out demons, revise Old Testament law, and forgive sins. He even went so far as to claim that everyone's eternal destiny is determined solely by whether we believe in him. Jesus' self-understanding cannot be reduced to that of a Jewish teacher or a charismatic leader. No. In fact, by putting himself in God's place, Jesus was making a far greater claim about himself than anyone else ever has, before or since. So the question Jesus asked his disciples confronts each of us as well. Who do you say that I am?
So, as a summary, that video is looking at the historical sources in the New Testament, not looking at them as a divinely inspired words of God, but as just ancient documents. And you put them through historical filters to see, what shakes out. So it's not arguing a circle. You're not saying because the Bible says Jesus is God, therefore Jesus is God. It's saying, what did Jesus himself think himself to be? It's looking at what are called criteria of authenticity, things like cultural fit. Lost my train of thought. Cultural fit, simplicity, less ad hocness, those sorts of things. And we're talking about general consensus of New Testament scholarship. So not just evangelical or conservative scholars, but also liberal scholars and moderate scholars. Okay. So as a summary, the Jewish Messiah, Jesus claimed to be the Jewish Messiah, and you can see the references there, Mark 11 and John 12, and Zechariah 9. Zechariah 9 is the prophecy of Jesus being on donkeys coming into Jerusalem. Claimed to be the Son of God in a unique sense, Mark 12, that's the parable of the vineyard. And then the claimed to be the Son of Man, and that was at the trial, at the trial at Mark 14, and Jesus' reference to the Daniel 7 passage about who the Son of Man is. Okay? And also it talked about Jesus' ministry of miracle working. Scholars agree that Jesus did what people took to be miracles. Were they really miracles? That's where the debate sort of happens between an atheist scholar or a Christian scholar or whatever. Okay? But they have no doubt that Jesus did miracles. He did exorcisms. Now, were those real or not? That's where the debate is. And he also claimed divine authority. If you remember in the Gospels, it talks about how people were surprised that Jesus taught with authority. And what that means was, usually teachers at that time, they would cite Rabbi so-and-so to back up whatever they were teaching. But Jesus didn't cite Rabbi so-and-so. He cited himself. And that just shocked everybody. You know, who do you think you are to cite yourself? And Jesus would change Old Testament law. And again, you know, who do you think you are to change Old Testament law? So those are some of the claims to divine authority. So who did Jesus think he was? Who do you think Jesus is? And then Romans 10:9, a little theology here, is what is the gospel? What's the good news of Jesus? And the good news is that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, which means Jesus is God, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. So that's the gospel in a nutshell. So with that, my presentation is finished. Here's some resources, and I have some books up here that I got a lot of this material from, and you're welcome to go through it. Just don't take it home because these are mine.